Welcome to Mormon Land, a podcast all about the news and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Managing Editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined by Senior Religion Reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hello, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
Before we start, here's a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com, where you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, podcast transcripts, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, please follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's show. The ever-expanding tally of temples under President Russell Nelson is truly staggering. Since taking the helm of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he has announced 185, more than half, of the faith's global total of 367 planned or existing temples. At the recently completed General Conference, the 100-year-old religious leader explained the reason for the building spree rather succinctly. God commanded it, he declared, because, quote, the Savior is coming again, end quote. Historian Benjamin Park sees other forces at play as well. In a recent piece for the Salt Lake Tribune titled Russell Nelson's Billion-Dollar Gamble, he points to the millions spent on each temple as among the faith's justifications for the billions it has in financial reserves. Even more, top church leaders view these relatively lavish buildings with their promises of eternal blessings as a way to cement Latter-day Saints in the faith. If we build them, the thinking goes, they will stick. Ben Park, author of American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, joins us today to discuss the church's temple frenzy, how it compares to the past, what it means in the present, and what it may portend for the future. Ben, welcome.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so put your historian hat on. Explain briefly how temples were viewed in the early days of the church.
Yeah, the LDS church wasn't even a year old before Joseph Smith started dictating revelations that promised coming temples, these sacred spaces that are a bridge point between the earth and the heavens and where humanity can converse with the divine. The notion of temples, of course, evolved over the next few years, but eventually the LDS Church built their first temple in Kirtland, Ohio, and then a much bigger temple in Nauvoo, and then, of course, started building more when they arrived in Utah, and then now have hundreds across the globe. These temples have always been a central point of Latter-day Saint faith, in part because they can participate in sacred rituals and ordinances that bring eternal meaning both to themselves and for the deceased, but they're also a symbol of their devout faith, that those temples are a sacrifice to the divine, which is why they're not just shacks. They are, ornate structures that signify how much they are committed to God's plan.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. So they've always been more elaborate, elegantly built than their typical, what we see now, meeting houses and things like that, right? That's not some new phenomenon.
Yeah, in fact, in the first few years of the 1830s, when Joseph Smith is dictating revelations and giving instructions that we are going to have to build a temple, several of his followers seem to interpret that as just a congregation house. Maybe we'll just build it out of wood, as one of them suggested. And Joseph Smith said, no, this is going to be a much grander phenomenon. And so their early designs for a temple, first in Independence, Missouri, then eventually in Kirtland, Ohio, were both a mixture of what you might find in a common New England meeting house, but also a much grander plan of sacred architecture that symbolized something more. And so when they completed the Kirtland Temple, it quite literally bankrupted the church because they're using resources far beyond what they had at their hand. So it was always this notion of reaching this has to represent your best, gathering the best materials, because that signified your love and devotion and commitment to following God's dictates.
And have they always been viewed as the highest form of Mormon worship?
Yeah, and they've always been prioritized too. The LDS Church built temples before they built meeting houses because they felt that those temples were the capstone of their devotion, not just, learning God's will through, meetings in them, but also the ordinances that are performed. And of course, those ordinances are developed as they're imagining and eventually constructing these temples and even evolving after the temples are built. But they always saw the temples are the pinnacle of the Mormon tradition, that everything was supposed to point toward those temples. And so from the very beginning, Mormons were a temple building people because that was the highest achievement you can gain in their earthly existence.
So let's come back to the present. Current church leaders have said one reason for the boom is to make temples more accessible to members across the globe. Do you see some examples of that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. And remember when the first temples were built a century ago, and I apologize for going back to the past, but I still have my historian's cap on after David asked me to. The first temples that were built the Mormons were primarily located in the Mountain West. And so that's where you see the temples constructed. And then when they started building temples abroad, that was a symbol of the end of the gathering was over and the church was going to build up where these congregations are. So when they built temples in Laie, Hawaii, or Alberta, Canada, that's because there were congregations and they wanted to allow those saints to have access to those rituals and not have to travel all the way to Utah. And then across the 20th century, you see a slowly filtering out of other temples, the Bern, Switzerland temple in the 1940s, of course, representing the church's entrance into Europe. And then in Gordon B. Hinckley's presidency in the 1990s and early aughts, you see the first massive explosion of the number of temples being built. And the saying went that Gordon B. Hinckley's vision was, I want every saint within a day's voyage of a temple. And as someone who was raised in New Mexico, in my youth, I saw that transition. When I was a youth, we would have to travel out to Phoenix, Arizona to go to the Mesa Temple. And that was a full day's travel out. And then by the time I graduated high school, they built the Albuquerque, New Mexico temple. That was one of the many temples that Gordon B. Hinckley went. And so that kind of fulfilled that idea. Now I think we're seeing that to a further degree. If under Gordon B. Hinckley, it was like, I want every saint to be able to travel within a day to a temple. Under Russell Nelson is like, I want everyone to be able to go down the block to a temple, or I want everyone to have one in their neighborhood. If Spencer W. Kimball was every member of missionary, under Nelson, it's almost every member of mission president or temple president. I think that their accessibility is one of the things, although now they are so accessible that there must be other reasons as well.
So you talk about, speaking of that, you talk about plenty of places where that are getting additional temples that already have nearby ones. Utah has 31 or planned or existing temples. Dallas and Las Vegas also have multiple temples. So why build them there?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of reasons that are given. One, I'm sure they would say that the population demands it, right? That there are going to be 31 in Utah because there are that many Latter-day Saints. And therefore, if we have some mathematical formula, and I know there are a lot of, Harvard Business School guys that are up at the top, and they probably have some equation and analytically able to determine, there's so much population that deserves a temple. I think there's also a sense to where we want more buy-in from these local congregations, to where if you have it in a local congregation, then you're going to have to staff that temple. You're going to have to do volunteer work. You're going to have temple trips. You're going to, connect that to your temple work. And so I think a lot of these regions, even if they already have a temple, and even if that temple isn't overused, I think just having additional temples, the church would argue it provides additional opportunities. So to give another example from my neighborhood, I live in the Houston area. We already have a temple in Houston in the northern suburbs, and they announced there's going to be another one built in the southern suburbs of Houston. Now, I am told by Latter-day Saints in the Houston region that the Houston temple is not overcrowded. You don't have a hard time going to get a reservation to get an endowment session on a Wednesday evening. But I don't think that the overcrowding is one of the major analytics they use to justify these new temples. I think instead the Latter-day Saint leaders are looking at the Houston region and they're saying, well, we have 4 missions that are housed here. We have, 8 different stakes in the Houston area. That should justify that theoretically they should be able to fill 2 temples. And so I think access is one point, responsibility is another, and population, of course, is filling in as well.
Ben, is there any evidence that temples help tether members to their faith?
So that's the type of practical evidence that us scholars just don't have access to. We have, anecdata, right? We're listening to a lot of people and we try to extrapolate out. The LDS Church does have that data. I mean, I'm often asked as a historian, what sources do you wish you could have access to? And they think I'll say something like John Taylor's diaries or something. My answer is always, I want access to all these survey data that the church is gathering in all these wards and stakes across the world, which is probably the most detailed, dense, and substantial collection of religious experience caught in numbers in perhaps the entire globe. So I imagine the LDS Church, and of course, many of us have heard these statements by church leaders saying that those who are baptized, are endowed in the temple, married in the temple, and then have a temple recommend are far more likely to remain active in the church. Whether there's data to back that up, I don't know. We don't have access to that. I imagine the church does. So the church may be driven by that type of data, or it may be based on an ideological theorizing of what an active membership means. And so Latter-day Saint leaders could be thinking, well, if a neighborhood is trying to staff a temple, that means they have to have volunteers working the temple. That means they have to have patrons. They have to have ward outings. To do all that, you have to have a temple recommend. And to have a temple recommend, you have to pay tithing. You have to attend church. You have to hold down a calling. And so when they're building these temples, I imagine they see that as the recipe necessary to create a strong, active member. And so to be able to hold them in the church, you need to have that connection. And I think that the temple recommend is the best exhibit of that good standing in the church. And building more temples, I think in their minds means equals more temple recommends.
So speaking of that, I mean, you talked about Houston. Many temples seem to be going in places where membership numbers are either stagnant or actually shrinking.
Yeah.
So that kind of it's a kind of chicken and egg thing. But do you see these temples helping in those places?
Well, I mean, that's getting into the prophecy, and historians make horrible prophets. I think the church leaders hope that's the case. I think there's an aspirational concept there that every brick they lay to build these temples is done so with a hope that there are going to be people to fill it. That's why I used in the Tribune story the quotation from Field of Dreams, which David mentions in the opening, to where when the Kevin Costner player builds the baseball fields, he didn't know who was going to fill them. He eventually it was a ghost, and eventually it was his lost dad. I think church leaders, when Russell Nelson and others are building these temples, they're doing so as a leap of faith, justified by their financial reserves, so it's not so much of a risk, but they feel like this is a strategic risk that we can take, to where if we expend these resources, we're hoping it's going to result in higher retention and better membership numbers. And I mean, also in more temple rituals and greater spirituality. And that is going to result in a much more robust Latter-day Saint community.
So we've noticed that the church tends to put temples, at least in the U.S. that we're aware of, in the suburbs, suburban neighborhoods, where they sometimes bump into opposition about their size and scale. You've probably read about the debates about the height of the steeple and increased traffic, those things that you often hear in zoning disputes. Would the church be better, and this is not a question for a historian, of course, thinking more about urbanized temples that would also help keep those members, ostensibly, if some of these other theories are correct, more in the church, and also allow lower income members to access them, reach them through transit, those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And don't ever worry about asking a historian non-historical topics. Historians always think we can speak in every field. So there's no worry there.
Okay.
I think that whether it's deliberately done or not, you can look at the result of where these temples are placed, to where they are often located in affluent neighborhoods, only accessible through cars, and usually closer to and staffed by members who live within those communities. I don't think in general that's a deliberate thing, to where church leaders are saying we want to prioritize richer members of the church. I don't think that's the case, but I do think it's a consequence of what's going on. I do think that there are consequences that I wish the church would realize when they are building these temples. I can't think of many of the new temples being built in urban communities. Now, of course, there are probably practical reasons for why that's the case. I'm sure land is much cheaper out in the suburbs. I'm sure they want space for parking lots. They usually already own that land because it's connected to a stake center. And so I'm sure there are practical reasons that they say are the priority why they are doing that. But I do think that there are real life consequences that, as you say, mean that it disproportionately affects those who live in urban communities, those who do not have access to cars, and those who don't live in the suburbs. And it reaffirms a stereotype that this is a suburban religion.
I'm going to ask you a question, and I haven't thought much about this myself, but do you see any difference in kind of what the church is doing vis-a-vis temples internationally, like in the global south or other places? What are you witnessing there?
That's a great question, David. I honestly am not equipped to answer. I don't know where many of these temples are being built on the global scene. I'm not an expert in those places. There may be a pattern in which they are trying to replicate what they're doing in the United States that would follow along what they've done, over the last century, where they use examples in America and then try to push it off on the global stage. But they might be adapting in different formats in those different settings. I honestly don't know.
So you've talked about staffing of these temples. Our listeners may know that they're all staffed by volunteers, which typically means retired people or single career families, which is getting to be less and less. How do you think that the staffing of these temples has been affected by changing work patterns?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think many outside observers might be shocked to what degree the LDS Church is driven by volunteer labor, not just, volunteer people fulfilling ecclesiastical positions at the local ward level, but the vast army of not just young missionaries who go out around the age of 20, but these senior missionaries who often serve several missions, some humanitarian, some proselytizing, and some, working for the church office building. I'm aware of a number of wonderful senior missionaries working in the church historians department in Salt Lake City. But then, of course, all of these senior missionaries who serve in temples. I served my LDS mission in Washington, D.C., and there was always an army of these senior missionaries coming out from Utah, living in these nice apartments right next to the Washington, D.C. temple, and their full job was working in those temples. So every time they build these temples, that's going to require more of volunteer labor. Now, some of the bigger temples are going to have temple missionaries, but I imagine a majority of these new temples being built are going to rely on local labor. And now that we live in an environment, especially in the American context, where people are expected to work longer, to work until later ages, they just don't have as much retirement years that they can devote to working in the temples. Which is why I've seen, and again, this is anecdata, so I don't know how widespread this is, but this is why you see a lot of stakes that are near temples now calling younger members as temple workers. When I was a young adult, I was called as a temple worker in the nearby temple, and the temple president told me that was a new initiative because they didn't have enough senior missionaries or senior members to actually serve in the temple. So I think about places like Manti, Utah, which already has the Manti Temple, which was recently rededicated. And then when they announced that they were going to renovate the Manti Temple, and there was enough of a pushback to where they backed off that plans, but they announced that they were going to build the Ephraim Temple just, 20 minutes down the road. I don't know if those wards have enough senior members who are going to be able to staff both of those temples. From what I gather, they already had hard enough time staffing the Manti Temple. So I think your question is prescient, Peggy, that in a world that further values elongated labor, especially from senior members of society, that's going to decrease the potential labor pool of those who can work in these temples. I imagine they're probably already seeing a decrease in senior missionaries who can do this full time, but they'll probably also seeing it at the local level in terms of who can devote several days a week to work as a temple worker in the local temple.
And not only that, but patrons, I'm told that temples, you mentioned DC, Boston, New York, these are temples that really are pretty much appointment only. They are not staffed all day long, every day, because there are not enough patrons. And on top of that, a friend was telling me that in those urban areas, people who've moved there for work then end up retiring not in those areas. They retire back to wherever they came from, usually Utah or somewhere like that. And so, again, fewer retired people available to be workers. So the upshot seems to be, and you tell me if you've seen this, just fewer temples open all the time and fewer people who can staff them.
Yeah, I can even give a specific example of that particular dynamic, which I think is absolutely correct. I was part of a BYU study program that went out to Nauvoo, Illinois for a whole semester in the early 2000s. I was out there a few semesters after the Nauvoo temple was dedicated. And they had this vision. I mean, the temple president was quite explicit about this. They had this vision that all these Latter-day Saints were going to retire in the Nauvoo area, and they're going to be staffing the Nauvoo temple. And so when I was there, the temple hours, they were open every day from, 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. and had several endowment sessions. And then when I went back several years later, it was appointment only unless you're there during the tourist season, that they had already changed that. And I imagine that is increasing the case in many different temples in the nation, which is why I think many of these announcements for temple construction, at least in the American context, and especially in the regions where they already had temples, they're often aspirational. I think it's a way to kind of encourage the Latter-day Saints. You can't take the temple for granted. We need you to attend. We want you to be, filling those hours. We want to be able to have the temple open several nights a week. And it may very well be that 40 years down the road, there's going to be a Spirit of Halloween banner hung outside some of these temples that just don't have as much use, right? But I think the church is hoping the opposite. They're saying that God is telling us that this is the way to build a temple attending people. And so it's a signal to the Latter-day Saints that, hey, you have no excuses. It's just down the road from you. You need to attend, which means you need to be temple recommend worthy, which means you need to be paying the tithing and holding a calling. And so I think in a way it's a chastisement that the church leaders are saying, we are investing in you. We now expect for you to invest in return by actually attending.
So, we would love to be able to report when we talk about a temple opening how much it cost, like we do, say, a public courthouse or a city hall. But of course, the church not obligated to tell us that. So now some information has come out. The Pocatello temple reportedly cost like $70 million, correct? Presumably, it's a little bit larger temple. Presumably, there are temples that are less. There are, I'm sure, temples that cost much more. But the church has really deep pockets. It doesn't seem like finances is ever really going to be a real issue as far as continuing to build these temples, correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the finances play a huge role in this. And church leaders would agree with that, to where the financial reserves is what's enabling this massive temple growth. I was speaking to the Wall Street Journal reporter, Jonathan Weil, who did the report on the Pocatello Temple and other recent temples, and talked about this temple spending spree. And he said that over a year of speaking to the presiding bishopric and other church leaders who were over the finances, he noticed a particular shift in their rhetoric. To where at the start of the attention that they were getting on having these several $100 billion of financial reserves, they'd say, well, this is our rainy day fund. This is our preparation for a future crisis. And I think church leaders realize that doesn't really hold water in the public image. That's a large rainy day fund. And so he noticed an emphasis, and you all, of course, are the experts in targeting church leaders over the years. So you probably heard the same thing. This shift in rhetoric to where instead of saying rainy day fund, rainy day fund, rainy day fund, soon they started saying, this is allowing temples. This is enabling us to fulfill long-held prophecies to build these temples. So their perspective is growing this financial nest egg is allowing us to fulfill long expected ideas, to where now they'll tell reporters that we expect building hundreds and thousands of temples in the future. A more cynical take is that this is one way that they can, give a reason, a justification for having those financial reserves. That this explains we're not just hoarders, that we're putting it to good use. So I think building those temples is at the very least enabled by, and it probably even justifies their humongous financial reserves.
Mm-hmm. Of course, they're not really transparent on their finances, so we really don't even know how much money is coming from reserves or just from operating funds that they have, correct?
Right. I think it's just a public symbol, right? Even though they're not releasing the receipts from building these various temples, just the fact that they're growing, I think, is signifying to the world, look, the church is in strong shape. We're using our finances wisely. And of course, not every temple is a Pocatello temple bringing in wood from Bethlehem or wherever they're bringing in the different resources. I mean, they've also announced several temples that are kind of in this cookie cutter model, the build on demand type of temples that probably decrease the cost for building those temples. So I think financial reserves, the church has made it very clear that they are not interested in transparency. They believe that would undercut whatever the purpose or their authority. But I think building those temples, they think signifies that they are wise financial stewards and that you can trust us with your tithing dollars because we are using them to their best ends.
So you, the article you wrote for the Tribune had a pretty provocative title. And I think we've touched on a little bit of it right now, but you call this temple push under President Nelson a gamble. Why is it a gamble? I think we sort of touched on a little bit, but why would you say it's a gamble?
Well, on the very monetary value, this is pouring in billions of dollars for this foreseeable future. I mean, President Nelson has announced over 150 temples. Only a small fraction of those have been completed. Many of them haven't even had a groundbreaking. So the bills for these temples is going to be going years into the future. I mean, this is a lot of financial commitment made in a short period of time. I think back to in the 1950s when David O. McKay launched a similar spending spree on meeting houses. And in the 1950s, church membership seemed to be booming. There seemed no end in sight. It was an era of economic optimism in the nation. And so David M. McKay just greenlights all these major construction costs. And within a decade and a half, the church is nearly cash broke. And if it wasn't for N. Eldon Tanner and other church leaders who kind of reversed that, the church would have been in difficult financial straits. So it's a gamble to tie up so much money into a particular thing. But I think President Nelson and other church leaders see this gamble as one that is divinely sanctioned. Of course, they argue that God has told us so. That's what he said at the last General Conference. But further, they're looking at a world of religious disaffiliation, of people falling away from church activity in the broader American context and the world context, as many are turning towards secularism and away from organized religion. And the fastest growing religious group in America is the nones, those who affiliate, who are spiritual but not religious and don't want to belong to any religious congregation. And every church is trying to deal with that problem. How do we keep butts in seats? How do we keep members between our walls? How do we keep tithing dollars coming in? And it seems like Nelson's answer to that problem is, well, we need to root all these members in temples. We need to make them committed to filling our temple endowment sessions, which means they have to have temple recommends, which means they have to be attending, paying tithing, holding a calling. And so I think Nelson's solution to the massive problem of disaffiliation that's facing all religions, including Mormonism, is we need to have a stronger tether. And spending billions of dollars on temples seems to be one of his attempts to solve that problem.
So that's let's go back to history a little bit. So Mormonism has always been known for its strong sense of community. You did say that, that the temple is seen as the pinnacle. You don't get to the temple except through the ward, right? So do you see President Nelson emphasizing temple going, which is a kind of individual experience, over congregational worship? It seems to be de-emphasizing congregational worship and emphasizing temple worship. Is that a reversal of historic priorities, or is it? I mean, it does seem like there might be some consequences there.
I think you're exactly right. Temple worship is something where you're done silent, sitting through the ritual. And then once you make it through an endowment session, you're sitting in a celestial room on your own, no talking. If there's any talking, you have to do it in whispered hush. It's not a very communal experience like a ward potluck. And so the fact that during Nelson's tenure, they decreased church hours from 3 hours to 2 hours. They've cut down the number of youth events every week to where it's every other week rather than weekly. They've cut down on pageants, road shows, all these other elements of building community over the last few years. It really seems like Nelson is interested in atomizing Mormonism down to the nuclear family community, right? It is just you and your spouse and your children. And if you don't fit into that model, you have a decreasing amount of attachments to the church. So when I see Nelson, I argued in my book is kind of like a venture capitalist stripping down Mormonism to what he sees as the fundamentals that would eventually lead to explosive growth in his mind. And one of those key principles is temples, and the other is the traditional family. And he sees those two things as going hand in hand. And things that don't match that vision typically get stripped away. So, Peggy, I think you're exactly right. And I think that this chorus you've been singing for a while over these last few years with your reporting is absolutely accurate, to where Mormonism in a way is being hollowed out. It's no longer a societal experience. It's no longer a cultural identifier. It is an individual identity. And it's all coming down to the nuclear family and your individual relationship with God, which is a lot of benefit there. But I do think it's a reversal from some of the entrenched cultural experiences that had previously been seen as a crucial part of Mormonism, to where usually it used to be, one of the great signifiers of Mormon devotion is getting together on a road show for 48 hours on a weekend with your steak. Now the signal of being a best Mormon is going to the temple for 90 minutes on a Tuesday night, where you don't really hold any conversations with anyone else, but you're performing a salvific ritual that brings significance to your life, your family's life, and to the deceased.
But the irony is that, as I said, the path to the temple has to run through the ward. And if young people don't have a good social experience in the ward, they'll never make it to the temple. And so to downplay at a time when the church is acknowledging half the members are single, more than half are single. So they're not in a nuclear family. And I don't know, it just seems kind of counterproductive to only emphasize the temple without building up the wards.
Yeah, and this is why it's a gamble. Nelson is throwing in all his chips or all his dollars in this particular vein, where you might see other religious congregations who maybe among the more mainline liberal congregations across the nation, where they are responding to the same crisis of, well, we need to build community. We need to have social organizing. We need to have these social activities. And the LDS Church is taking a different vein. And we'll see over the next few decades which route seems to be more fruitful in retaining members.
So one last question, Ben, and you linked your article to President Nelson's gamble. So do you expect this temple push to continue or even expand after President Nelson?
It's a great question. And of course, we never know moving from one presidential administration to the next. Some presidents have surprised observers and how they take the faith in a different direction or continue in one. I think Nelson has proved especially adept at learning how to institute new institutional changes and policies that are going to long outlive his death. Nelson, more than many of his previous predecessors, recognized that rhetoric is one thing, but institutional reform is another. And he's been able to embed a lot of these changes into the structure of the church, which even if one of his successors wants to take it in a different direction, it will be really hard to disentangle it. And so, I mean, Nelson is quite literally tying up a lot of the church's budget going forward into these temple construction. Whether or not whether Dallin Oaks or whether Jeffrey Holland or David Bednar down the road share that same vision, they're still going to be dealing with the fallout of these temple constructions. And the question is, are you going to expand it even further, or are you just going to retain it? And that's well above my pay grade.
Thanks, Ben. The name of Ben's book, by the way, is American Zion, A New History of Mormonism. Benjamin Park, thanks for joining us.
Always an honor to be on.
Thanks also to Peggy Fletcher Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind you that you can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.